According to Susan K. Finston, a former executive of the American Bioindustry Alliance, stated that the first GM products were introduced into the United States around 1994. By 1999, approximately 60% of all produce found in the typical grocery store was grown using GM seeds. Today, 16.7 million farmers in 29 countries grow GM crops. According to Mark Melman, one of the nation's leading public opinion researchers and communication strategists, he stated that 91% of 1,000 general election voters surveyed were in support of labeling genetically engineered or GE foods. The office of Edmund G. Brown Jr. stated that the California budget has fallen short by nearly $16 billion. That means this election we need to pay particular attention to the financial aspects of the propositions we are considering enacting. That means we need to know the fiscal effects of Prop 37. Therefore, in this speech, I will inform you about how much Prop 37 will cost with relation to 1, litigation, 2, implementation, and 3, to you as the consumers. So first, let's discuss what it would cost to litigation-wise. Now, according to Mac Taylor, the legislative analyst for the state of California, the Act permits lawsuits to be filed against businesses that have violated the Act's requirements, the cost of which depends on the number of cases filed, those prosecuted by state and local governments, and how they are decided by the courts. Now, Thomas Hill-Tatch, who has practiced political and election law exclusively since 1988, states that there is a possibility of abusive litigation arising due to the portion of the Act that permits lawyers, that does not require lawyers to have a client who is actually damaged by the alleged violation. Nonetheless, we can estimate the costs of increased litigation by comparing the Act to Prop 65, which is another Consumer Disclosure Act, this one being the California Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986. Now, James Cooper, who works as a research professor and lecturer in law and has a PhD in economics, states that although adopting label GMO will likely result in private litigation to enforce the Act's provisions, the differences between these two props substantially reduces the potential for label GMO to foster the type of abusive private litigation associated with Prop 65. So what would the cost of increased litigation be? Well, according to Joanna Shepard Bailey, who is a tenured economics and law professor with a PhD in economics, she estimates an additional 9 cases to appear before the Supreme Courts on average per year. And because 9 is the amount for Prop 65. With the cost of this increased litigation, she states, should be less than $50,000, which translates into an additional 1 cent per person living in the state of California. Now, aside from litigation, there will obviously also be implementation costs. Now, again, according to Matt Taylor, depending on how the Department of Public Health, or DPH for short, and the extent to which it decides to implement its regulations. The cost of implementation could be anywhere from a few $100,000 to over $1 million annually. Now, again, we could determine how much, or estimate how much this would cost the state and the department by comparing the DPH's expected responsibilities to those of the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, OHA for short, responsibilities under Prop 65, and its corresponding administrative costs. Now, Bailey argues that, she states that OHA's annual expenditures under Prop 65 are averaged over the last 3 years $3.8 million. And she argues that Prop 37 will likely result in less oversight from the DPH than for the same reasons that Cooper does. Because one, it pertains to a narrower sector of substances, such as the consumption of GE foods sold at retail stores, and two, because the Act provides clear threshold standards, whereas OHA is nearly 3/8 of the way through completing those of theirs. She also states, that being said, she finds it difficult to imagine that Prop 37 the expenses to the department for administrative costs could be over 25% of those of OHA's for Prop 65. Nonetheless, even if the Act does result in a $1 million increase in expenditures, that the amount would be trivial by comparison to recent DPH spending and state spending. Now, she states that the DPH budget averaged over the past 3 years an approximate $3.3 billion. So an additional $1 million would result in an increase of 0.03%. And she states that the total state budget over the past 3 years has averaged nearly $125 billion. Thus an additional $1 million would increase in the administrative costs by 0.0008%. And in per capita terms, $1 million translates into 3 cents per person living in the state of California. Now, aside from litigation and implementation costs, let's discuss what it could cost you as consumers. Now, Bailey states that many categories of food will not require labeling, will be exempt from labeling under Prop 37, such as alcoholic beverages and animal products like eggs, milk, and certain types of meat. But she does state that, assuming that all food retail producers pass on the entire one-time expense for redesigning labels, the average price of these products would increase by 0.03%, which translates into an additional 67 cents per year for consumers. And she states that, assuming that all food retail stores pass on the entire one-time expense for installing store placards disclosing genetically engineering in their produce sections, it would result in an increased price of 0.01% for fresh fruits and vegetables, which translates into an additional 60 cents per person living in the state of California. Thus, she concludes that we should see, as consumers, no more than a $1.27 increase in our annual expenditures. Now that